The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the military hospital ward, casting harsh shadows across the sterile white walls. Commander Jake Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his bed, the fresh bandages around his shoulder pulling tight with every movement. Around him, 11 other Navy SEALs lay in various states of recovery, each man bearing the invisible weight of their recent mission gone wrong. The ambush had come out of nowhere. What was supposed to be a routine extraction in Afghanistan had turned into a nightmare when their helicopter took heavy fire during landing. Half the team was wounded, and now they found themselves sharing a recovery ward. Their brotherhood forged even stronger through shared pain and survival. Jake's eyes wandered across the room, taking inventory of his men. Rodriguez was propped up against pillows, his leg elevated and wrapped in thick white gauze. Thompson sat on the edge of his bed, absently rotating his wrist where shrapnel had torn through muscle and tendon. Carter, the youngest of their group at 23, stared at the ceiling with the hollow look that came after seeing much death too soon. The ward had been their world for the past week. They talked in the rough, abbreviated language of soldiers, sharing stories about home, complaining about the hospital food, and carefully avoiding discussion of the mission that had landed them there. The silence around that topic was heavy, filled with questions none of them were ready to voice outside their window. The Virginia countryside stretched green and peaceful, a stark contrast to the desert mountains where they had left pieces of themselves behind. The normalcy of it felt almost insulting. How could the world continue spinning when everything had changed? How could people drive to work and walk their dogs when good men had died in that valley? Jake had been asking himself these questions when the door to their ward opened with a soft whoosh. The conversation that had been flowing between the beds died instantly. They all expected another doctor or perhaps a nurse coming to check vitals and change dressings. Instead, a woman in military fatigues stepped through the doorway. She was small in stature, maybe 5 feet 4 inches, with auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Her uniform bore the insignia of a combat medic, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place in a world dominated by men twice her size. What struck Jake immediately was her eyes. They held a depth that spoke of experience, of things seen and decisions made under pressure. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and professional. "I'm Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun, and I'll be conducting some medical assessments today." The SEALs exchanged glances. They had been seen by dozens of medical personnel since arriving at the hospital, but something about this woman was different. She moved through the room with purpose, her gaze taking in not just their visible injuries but something deeper. She seemed to see past their tough exteriors to the wounds that bandages could not cover. Rodriguez, always the first to break tension with humor, cleared his throat. "Sergeant Chun, you sure you're in the right ward? We're not exactly the most cooperative patients." A small smile played at the corner of her mouth. "I've worked with worse, Marine." "Navy," Rodriguez corrected automatically, then caught himself. "Wait, did you just call us Marines?" "I know exactly who you are," Sarah replied calmly, pulling up a chair between the beds. "SEAL Team 6, extraction mission in Kunar Province. Helicopter took fire on landing. You've been here 7 days, and most of you haven't been sleeping." The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. She had not just recited their medical charts. She had acknowledged what they had been through. In that moment, she became more than just another medical professional checking boxes on a form. Jake studied her more carefully. There was something in the way she carried herself, a stillness that reminded him of his most experienced operators. It was the kind of calm that came only from being tested under fire and found not wanting. But what could a medic possibly have experienced that would give her that edge? "You've seen combat," Thompson said. It was not a question. Sarah's expression did not change, but Jake caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "I've served where I was needed." "That's not what he asked," Carter spoke up from his bed. It was the most he had said since arriving at the hospital. For a moment, Sarah was quiet, her gaze moving from one face to another. These men had given everything in service to their country, and they deserved honesty. They also needed something that the parade of doctors and specialists had not been able to provide, someone who truly understood what they had experienced. "I've done 3 tours," she said finally. 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. Forward operating bases mostly. Places where the medical tent was often the difference between going home and not going home. Rodriguez leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Which bases?" "Camp Ramadi, Fobshank, and a few smaller outposts that probably do not exist on any official maps anymore." Jake felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. These were not safe, rear-echelon postings. These were the bleeding edge of the war, places where medics did not just treat routine injuries but performed life-saving surgery under mortar fire. Places where medical personnel often found themselves picking up weapons when the perimeter was breached. "How long were you deployed total?" Jake asked. 14 months, 8 months, and 10 months respectively. Thompson whistled low. Back-to-back deployments like that were rare, especially for medical personnel. They suggested someone who had volunteered to go back, someone who had found purpose in the chaos and chosen to return to it again and again. "Any of you boys been to Shank?" Sarah asked. Carter's head turned sharply toward her. "I was there in 2018. That place was a shooting gallery." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "I was there when they overran the eastern perimeter. Spent 6 hours in the medical bunker with 23 wounded and no way to evacuate." The room went completely still. Fobshank had been one of the most dangerous postings in Afghanistan, a small base surrounded by hostile territory where attacks came daily. The eastern perimeter breach she was describing had been legendary among special operations units. A textbook example of how bad situations could get in an instant. Jake realized that this small woman, sitting calmly in their recovery ward, had probably seen more sustained combat than half the SEALs in the room. The revelation was both humbling and intriguing. What kind of person volunteered for that level of danger, not once but 3 times? As if reading his thoughts, Sarah stood and smoothed down her uniform. "I'll be back tomorrow to check on your progress. Try to get some rest." She moved toward the door, but Rodriguez called out, "Sergeant Chun? What made you keep going back?" Sarah paused at the threshold, her hand on the doorframe. "Someone had to." After she left, the ward remained quiet for a long time. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, processing what they had just learned. They had expected another routine medical check, but instead they had encountered someone whose story promised to be far more complex than any of them had imagined. Jake stared at the closed door, his mind racing. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ask the questions that really mattered. What had she seen in those medical bunkers? What had driven her to keep returning to places where death was a constant companion? And perhaps most importantly, what could she teach them about carrying the weight of what they had experienced? Outside their window, the Virginia countryside continued its peaceful existence, unchanged and unaware that something significant had just begun in Ward 7. Sarah Shin arrived at Ward 7 the next morning carrying a worn leather medical bag and a tablet that had seen better days. The early morning light filtered through the windows, creating patterns on the floor that reminded Jake of the shadows cast by helicopter rotors. He had been awake since 0400, his mind churning over yesterday's brief encounter. The other SEALs were stirring as well. Rodriguez was already sitting up, attempting to do some kind of physical therapy exercise with his injured leg. Thompson had managed to shower and was carefully pulling a clean t-shirt over his bandaged torso. Even Carter seemed more alert, though the hollow look in his eyes remained unchanged. "Morning, gentlemen," Sarah said, setting her bag down on the small table near the window. "I hope you all managed to get some sleep." "About as much as usual," Jake replied, which was to say very little. The nightmares had not stopped, and the antiseptic smell of the hospital did nothing to chase away the memories of dust and smoke and the metallic scent of blood. Sarah nodded as if she understood perfectly what he meant. She moved to Rodriguez first, checking the bandages on his leg with practiced efficiency. Her hands were steady and sure, but Jake noticed the small scar running along her left forearm, barely visible beneath her rolled-up sleeves. "This is healing well," she told Rodriguez. You should have full mobility back within 6 weeks, assuming you follow the physical therapy protocol. What about getting back to active duty? Rodriguez asked. Sarah's pause was almost imperceptible, but Jake caught it. That will depend on several factors. Physical recovery is just one part of the equation. She moved on to Thompson, examining the shrapnel wounds on his wrist and shoulder. Her touch was gentle but thorough, and Jake could see why wounded soldiers would trust her. There was something inherently calming about her presence, a steadiness that probably saved lives in chaotic situations. Sergeant Chun, Carter said suddenly. Yesterday you mentioned FOB Shank. What was the worst case you ever handled there? Sarah finished wrapping Thompson's wrist before answering. I don't usually discuss specific cases. We're not usual patients, Jake said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment, those deep eyes seeming to weigh something in her mind. Finally, she pulled the chair closer to Carter's bed and sat down. The gesture seemed to signal that she was settling in for a longer conversation. There was a convoy that hit an IED about 2 clicks from the base, she began, her voice taking on the flat, factual tone that soldiers used when recounting difficult memories. 3 vehicles, 12 men total. The lead vehicle took the worst of it. She paused, staring out the window at the peaceful Virginia landscape. We had about 40 minutes before the medevac helicopter could reach us, and that was if the landing zone stayed secure. But the Taliban had positioned themselves in the hills overlooking the blast site. Rodriguez had stopped his exercises and was listening intently. Thompson moved closer, settling into the chair beside his bed. The room had taken on the quality of a briefing, with all attention focused on Sarah's quiet voice. The first soldier they brought in had lost both legs below the knee and had massive abdominal trauma. He was conscious, asking about his squad mates. I had to make a choice, spend all my time trying to save him, or triage 3 other critical cases that had a better chance of survival. Jake felt his chest tighten. Every soldier understood the mathematics of triage, but understanding it intellectually and living it were completely different experiences. What did you do? Carter asked. I gave him enough morphine to make him comfortable, told him he was going to be fine, and then I moved on to the next patient. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. They all knew what that meant. She had looked into the eyes of a dying soldier, lied to him about his chances, and then moved on to save someone else. It was the kind of decision that haunted medical personnel for the rest of their careers. Did he make it? Thompson asked quietly. No, he died about 10 minutes before the helicopter arrived. Carter stared at the ceiling, his jaw working silently. Jake could see the young SEAL processing the story, connecting it to his own recent experiences with impossible choices and the weight of survival. How do you live with that? Carter finally asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently tracing the scar on her forearm. You live with it by remembering the 3 soldiers who did make it home because you chose to focus on them instead. You live with it by knowing that somebody had to make that decision and you were the one qualified to make it. But it still hurts, Rodriguez said. It was not a question. Every day, Sarah admitted. The day it stops hurting is the day you should find a different job. Jake found himself studying this woman with growing respect. She had carried the weight of life and death decisions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and yet she had chosen to keep going back. There had to be more to her story. Why did you volunteer for a 3rd deployment? Jake asked. Most medics do their time and get out, especially after tours like that. Sarah's expression shifted slightly, and Jake sensed he had touched on something deeper. That's a longer story. We've got time, Thompson said. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where other patients were being wheeled around in the sunshine. After my 2nd tour, I came back to a hospital in Germany. Clean sheets, regular meals, no mortar fire. It should have been a relief. She turned back to face them. But I kept thinking about the guys who were still over there, still getting hurt, still needing someone who knew what they were going through. I had gotten good at battlefield medicine, really good. And there weren't enough people with that experience to go around. So you went back? Carter said. I went back because I realized that what I had learned in those first 2 tours wasn't just medical knowledge. It was something deeper. I had learned how to stay calm when everything was falling apart, how to make decisions when there were no good options, how to keep hope alive in places where hope seemed impossible. Jake felt something click into place. This was why her presence felt different from the other medical staff. She was not just treating their physical injuries. She understood the invisible wounds that came with surviving when others had not. "Is that what you're doing here?" Rodriguez asked, "helping us figure out how to carry what we've seen?" Sarah returned to her chair, her medical bag forgotten for the moment. "I'm here because someone thought you might benefit from talking to someone who has been where you've been. Someone who understands that healing is not just about fixing what's broken in your body." Thompson leaned forward. "What did your third tour teach you that the first 2 didn't?" "That survival is not just about making it through the moment," Sarah said. "It's about learning how to live with the moments after you've made it through. How to carry the weight without letting it crush you." Jake found himself hanging on every word. This was the conversation they had all been avoiding since arriving at the hospital. The doctors had focused on their physical injuries. The psychiatrists had talked about trauma and stress, but no one had addressed the fundamental question that haunted every survivor. How do you continue living when part of you died back there? "On my third tour, I was stationed at a small outpost that got overrun," Sarah continued. "We had about 30 minutes of warning before they hit us with everything they had. I spent those 30 minutes helping to prepare defenses and setting up a trauma station in the communications bunker." She paused, and Jake could see her reliving the memory. "When the attack started, I realized that everything I had learned about emergency medicine was useless if I could not stay calm enough to apply it. Fear makes you stupid, panic makes you dangerous. So I had to learn how to find calm in the middle of chaos." "How?" Carter asked. "By accepting that I might die," Sarah said simply. "Once you truly accept that possibility, fear loses some of its power over you. You stop wasting energy on things you cannot control and focus everything on what you can control." The room fell silent as the SEALs absorbed this. It was a lesson they all understood in theory, but hearing it from someone who had lived it repeatedly gave it new weight. "That attack lasted 4 hours," Sarah continued. "By the end of it, I had treated 18 wounded soldiers, performed 2 field amputations, and helped defend the perimeter when the medics ran out of ammunition. When it was over, I realized that I had found something in that bunker that I had been looking for my whole life." "What was that?" Jake asked. Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the ward, and it transformed her entire face. "Purpose. The absolute certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do." Jake felt something stir in his chest, something he had not felt since waking up in this hospital bed. It was not hope exactly, but it was the recognition that hope might be possible. This woman had found a way to transform trauma into purpose, pain into strength. If she could do it, maybe they could too. Over the next 3 days, Sarah's visits became the highlight of Ward 7. She would arrive each morning with her worn medical bag, conduct her official assessments, and then settle into that chair between the beds for conversations that went far beyond anything in her job description. The SEALs found themselves looking forward to these sessions in a way that surprised them. They had been skeptical of the parade of psychiatrists and counselors who had attempted to help them process their experiences. Those well-meaning professionals had never worn a uniform, never felt the weight of a rifle, never made decisions with lives hanging in the balance. Their textbook approaches felt hollow and disconnected from reality. Sarah was different. When she talked about managing fear, she spoke from experience. When she discussed survivor guilt, her words carried the weight of someone who had lived with those feelings for years. Most importantly, when she looked at them, she saw soldiers, not broken patients in need of fixing on Thursday morning. She arrived to find Carter sitting by the window, staring out at the grounds with the same hollow expression he had worn for days. The other SEALs were engaged in their usual morning routine of physical therapy and half-hearted conversation. But Carter remained isolated, wrapped in a silence that seemed to deepen each day. Morning. Everyone, Sarah said, setting down her bag. Carter, how are you feeling today? Same as always, he replied without turning from the window. Sarah exchanged a look with Jake, who had been watching Carter with growing concern. The young SEAL had been the last one rescued from their downed helicopter, trapped in the wreckage for over an hour while his squad mates fought to free him. He had watched 2 soldiers die during that time, men who had been talking and laughing just minutes before the crash. Carter, Sarah said gently, would you mind if I checked your shoulder? I want to make sure that wound is healing properly. He finally turned away from the window, moving to his bed with the mechanical precision of someone going through motions. Sarah began her examination, her hands careful around the bandaged area where shrapnel had torn through his shoulder blade. This is healing well, she said. You should have full range of motion back soon. Great, Carter said flatly. I'm sure the next mission will go much better. The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. Rodriguez and Thompson exchanged concerned glances while Jake sat up straighter in his bed. They had all been dancing around Carter's emotional state, hoping he would work through it on his own. But it was becoming clear that approach was not working. Tell me about the helicopter, Sarah said quietly. What about it? What you remember from being trapped in there. Carter's jaw tightened. I remember everything. That's the problem. Sarah pulled her chair closer to his bed. Sometimes talking about what we remember helps us process it. Sometimes it helps us understand why we survived when others didn't. I know exactly why I survived, Carter said, his voice rising slightly. I survived because Martinez and Williams died protecting the helicopter while I was trapped like a coward in the wreckage. The room went silent. This was the first time Carter had spoken about the details of their mission, and his words hung in the air like an accusation. You think you were a coward? Sarah asked. I was pinned down, useless, while better men than me died trying to save my life? What would you call it? Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying Carter's face. Then she did something unexpected. She rolled up her left sleeve completely, revealing not just the small scar Jake had noticed before, but a network of scars that crisscrossed her forearm from wrist to elbow. I got these during my second tour, she said. We were treating casualties from a roadside bomb when the enemy started dropping mortar on our position. I was working on a soldier with massive chest trauma when a piece of shrapnel came through the tent wall and pinned my arm to his stretcher. Carter's attention was now fully focused on her. The other SEALs had stopped their morning routines and were listening intently. For 20 minutes, I was stuck there while mortar fell around us and my patient died on the table in front of me. I could hear other wounded soldiers calling for help, but I couldn't move. I couldn't do my job. But you were wounded, Carter protested. So were you, Sarah replied simply. Being trapped doesn't make you a coward, Carter. Being injured doesn't make you useless. Martinez and Williams died doing their jobs, just like you would have done yours if you had been able to move. But they're dead and I'm here, Carter said, his voice breaking slightly. Yes, they are. And that's something you're going to have to live with for the rest of your life. The question is, what are you going to do with the life they helped save? Jake felt his throat tighten as he watched Carter struggle with Sarah's words. This was the heart of what they were all dealing with, the fundamental unfairness of survival. Why did some people make it home while others didn't? Why did good men die while others lived to carry the guilt? How do you live with it? Rodriguez asked quietly. Knowing that people died while you survived? Sarah turned to address the room. You live with it by honoring their sacrifice. Not by feeling guilty about surviving, but by making sure their deaths meant something. How? Thompson asked. By being the best version of yourself that you can be. By using the skills they help preserve to make the world a little bit better. By remembering them not as victims, but as heroes who made a choice to save their brothers. She turned back to Carter. Martinez and Williams didn't die because you were trapped. They died because they believed your life was worth saving. When you call yourself a coward, you're insulting their judgment and their sacrifice. Carter stared at her for a long moment, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to make their sacrifice worth it. Start small, Sarah said. Start by getting up each morning and deciding to live that day fully. Start by taking care of yourself so you can take care of others. Start by accepting that survival doesn't require you to carry guilt as proof that you cared about the people you lost. She reached into her medical bag and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed a group of soldiers in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera despite the harsh sun and dusty conditions. This was my team during my second tour, she said, passing the photo around. 5 of these 8 people died during our deployment. For years, I carried their deaths like stones in my chest, convinced that I should have been able to save them all. Jake studied the photograph. Sarah looked younger, her smile wider and more carefree. But even in the photo, he could see the determination in her eyes that would carry her through 3 tours of duty. What changed? He asked. I realized that carrying guilt wasn't honoring them. It was wasting the life they had helped preserve. They didn't sacrifice themselves so I could spend years feeling bad about surviving. They sacrificed themselves because they believed the mission was important and the people around them were worth saving. Carter took the photograph and stared at it for a long time. Do you still think about them? Every day, Sarah said. But now when I think about them, I remember their courage, their jokes, their dedication. I remember the good they did and the lives they saved. I try to live in a way that would make them proud. Thompson leaned forward. Is that why you kept deploying? To honor them? Partly, but also because I realized that my guilt was a luxury I couldn't afford. There were other soldiers who needed what I had learned, other situations where my experience could make the difference between someone living and dying. Wallowing in guilt was selfish when I could be using that energy to help people. Jake felt something shift in his understanding. He had been thinking about their failed mission as an ending, a tragic conclusion to their deployment. But Sarah was suggesting it could be a beginning, a foundation for something larger than their individual pain. After I accepted that I was going to survive, Sarah continued, I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be with the life I had left. Did I want to be someone defined by trauma and loss? Or did I want to be someone who had been tested and found strong enough to carry on? She stood and collected her medical bag. That's a choice each of you will have to make. But remember, you don't have to make it alone, and you don't have to make it all at once. As she reached the door, Carter called out, Sergeant Chun? How long did it take you to stop feeling guilty? Sarah paused, her hand on the doorframe. I'll let you know when it happens. But the guilt gets lighter when you start carrying purpose alongside it. After she left, Ward 7 remained quiet for a long time. Carter was still holding the photograph, studying the faces of Sarah's fallen comrades. Finally, he looked up at his fellow SEALs. Maybe she's right, he said quietly. Maybe Martinez and Williams would want better for me than this. It was the first sign of hope any of them had seen from him since arriving at the hospital. And it sparked something in the room that had been missing for days. For the first time, they began to believe that healing might actually be possible. By Friday, word had spread through the hospital about the unusual dynamic developing in Ward 7. Other medical staff noticed that the SEALs who had been sullen and uncooperative were now engaging more actively in their physical therapy. They were sleeping better, eating more, and beginning to display glimpses of the camaraderie that had made them effective as a unit. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the head of psychiatric services, made a point of stopping by during Sarah's morning visit. She was a competent professional who had worked with military personnel for over a decade, but she had been frustrated by her inability to connect with these particular patients. Sarah was in the middle of checking Rodriguez's leg when Dr. Hawkins entered the ward. The psychiatrist observed silently as Sarah worked, noting the easy rapport between the medic and the SEALs. There was something happening here that went beyond standard medical care. Good morning, gentlemen, Dr. Hawkins said after Sarah finished her examination. I hope you don't mind if I observe today. The SEALs exchanged glances. They had been dreading another session with the psychiatrist, whose well-intentioned but clinical approach had felt disconnected from their experiences. But with Sarah present, they felt more confident about engaging in difficult conversations. "Actually," Jake said, "I think it would be good for you to hear some of what Sergeant Chun has been sharing with us." Sarah looked surprised. "I'm not sure that's appropriate. Dr. Hawkins has her own methods." "Please," Carter interrupted. "I think she should hear about your third tour, about what you learned in that bunker." Dr. Hawkins pulled up another chair, her professional curiosity clearly piqued. Sarah glanced around the room, seeing expectant faces looking back at her. These men had opened up to her in ways they hadn't with anyone else, and now they wanted to share that experience with someone who might help other soldiers facing similar struggles. "All right," Sarah said, settling back into her usual spot. "But I want to be clear that I'm not a trained therapist. I'm just someone who has been through some of the same things you have." Dr. Hawkins nodded. "Sometimes that's exactly what patients need." Sarah began to recount the story of her final deployment, but this time she included details she had not shared before. She described the small forward operating base where she had been stationed, a place so remote that it appeared on maps only as a grid coordinate. The base housed 37 soldiers and was surrounded by hostile territory on all sides. "We knew an attack was coming," Sarah said. "Intelligence suggested that enemy forces were massing for a major assault, but we didn't know when or from which direction it would come. For 3 weeks, we lived with that constant tension, always ready, always watching." Thompson leaned forward. "That kind of sustained stress can break people down." "It nearly broke me," Sarah admitted. "By the second week, I was barely sleeping. I was jumping at every sound, second-guessing every medical decision, convinced that I was going to fail when the moment came." Dr. Hawkins made notes as Sarah spoke, recognizing the classic symptoms of anticipatory anxiety and combat stress. "The night before the attack, I was on duty in the medical tent when a soldier came in with what he claimed was a sprained ankle. But when I examined him, I could see that he was really there because he was scared. He needed someone to tell him he was going to be okay." Sarah paused, looking around at the SEALs who were listening intently. "I realized that I had been so focused on preparing for physical casualties that I had forgotten about the emotional wounds we were all carrying. This soldier didn't need medical treatment. He needed hope." "What did you do?" Rodriguez asked. I told him the truth. I told him that I was scared too, but that fear was normal and it didn't make him weak. I told him that we were all in this together and that our job was to take care of each other, no matter what happened. Carter shifted in his bed. "Did that help him?" "It helped both of us," Sarah said, "because saying it out loud helped me realize that fear wasn't my enemy. Fear was information. It was my mind's way of preparing me for what was coming." Dr. Hawkins looked up from her notes. "That's a remarkably mature insight, Sergeant Chun. Many of my patients struggle to reframe their fear in such positive terms." "I didn't get there overnight," Sarah said. "It took time and a lot of conversations with people who had been where I was." She continued her story, describing how the attack had unfolded in the early hours of the morning. Enemy forces had surrounded the base and launched a coordinated assault from multiple directions. The communications equipment was knocked out in the first few minutes, leaving them isolated and unable to call for support. For the first hour, I was exactly where I expected to be, in the medical tent, treating wounded soldiers as they were brought in. But then the perimeter was breached, and suddenly I wasn't just a medic anymore. Jake could picture the scene, a small medical tent becoming a final line of defense, with Sarah having to transition from treating wounds to preventing them. I grabbed a rifle and joined the defense of the communications bunker, where we had set up a makeshift trauma station. For 4 hours, I alternated between shooting at enemy positions and working on wounded soldiers. It was the most terrifying and the most focused I had ever been in my life. "How did you manage to function in that situation?" Dr. Hawkins asked. "I stopped thinking about myself," Sarah said simply. "There was no time for fear or self-doubt or worrying about whether I was good enough. There were only immediate problems that needed immediate solutions. Rodriguez nodded slowly. That's what it's like during a mission. Everything else just falls away. Exactly. And that's when I realized something important. I had been carrying around all this anxiety about whether I could handle combat, whether I was strong enough, whether I would panic under pressure. But when the moment actually came, those questions became irrelevant. I just did what needed to be done. Thompson sat back in his chair. So the fear was worse than the reality. In some ways, yes. Don't get me wrong, the reality was terrifying. People died, including some I couldn't save. But the anticipatory fear, the constant worry about how I would react, was actually more debilitating than the actual experience. Dr. Hawkins set down her pen. That's consistent with what we know about anxiety disorders. The fear of fear often causes more suffering than the thing being feared. Sarah turned to face the psychiatrist directly. The problem is that traditional therapy approaches often focus on eliminating fear or managing symptoms. But for soldiers, fear is a tool. It keeps us alive. The goal shouldn't be to get rid of it, but to learn how to use it effectively. Can you elaborate on that? Fear sharpens your focus, heightens your awareness, floods your system with energy. In combat situations, those are advantages if you know how to channel them. The soldiers who get in trouble are the ones who either ignore their fear completely or let it overwhelm them. Carter looked thoughtful. So you're saying there's a middle ground? I'm saying that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is feeling the fear and choosing to act anyway, because something else is more important than your own safety. Jake felt something click into place in his mind. This was what had been missing from all the other therapeutic approaches they had encountered. Everyone else had treated their trauma symptoms as problems to be solved. But Sarah was suggesting that their experiences could be transformed into strengths. After the attack was over, Sarah continued, I realized that I had found something I didn't even know I was looking for. Not just the ability to function under extreme stress, but a sense of purpose that made everything else make sense. What kind of purpose? Dr. Hawkins asked. The knowledge that I could make a real difference in the worst possible circumstances. That my skills, my training, my willingness to be there when things got bad, all of that could mean the difference between someone living or dying. She looked around at the SEALs. That's what I see when I look at all of you. Not broken soldiers who need fixing, but people who have proven they can function at the highest level under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The question isn't whether you can recover from what you've been through. The question is how you're going to use what you've learned. Dr. Hawkins closed her notebook. Sergeant Chun, I think we could learn a lot from your approach. Would you be willing to participate in some of our other treatment programs? Sarah glanced at the SEALs, who were nodding encouragingly. If it would help other soldiers, I'd be happy to. As the two women began discussing the possibilities, Jake felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced since waking up in the hospital. Sarah had given them more than just her story. She had given them a framework for understanding their own experiences in a new way, but he sensed there was still more to learn from her, still deeper lessons about how to transform trauma into purpose. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ask her about the hardest part. How do you come home from that kind of intensity and build a normal life? Saturday morning brought news that would change everything for Ward 7. Dr. Martinez, the hospital administrator, arrived with discharge papers for 3 of the SEALs. Rodriguez, Thompson, and 2 others had healed sufficiently to continue their recovery at home. The prospect of leaving should have been welcome news, but instead it created an unexpected anxiety. I don't know if I'm ready, Thompson admitted to Jake as they watched the morning activity outside their window. In here, everyone understands what we've been through. Out there, people are going to expect us to just go back to normal. Jake understood the concern. The hospital had become a cocoon where their experiences were validated and their struggles were understood. The outside world felt unpredictable and potentially hostile, filled with people who would never comprehend what they had seen and done. When Sarah arrived that morning, she immediately sensed the tension in the room. The SEALs who were leaving were packing their few belongings with mechanical precision, while those staying behind watched with a mixture of envy and relief. "I heard about the discharges," Sarah said, setting down her medical bag. "How is everyone feeling about that?" "Terrified," Rodriguez said bluntly. "At least in here, nobody expects me to pretend everything is fine." Sarah nodded as if she had expected this response. The transition back to civilian life is often harder than people realize. Even families and friends who want to help don't always know how. "How did you handle it?" Carter asked. "After your tours ended, how did you readjust to normal life?" Sarah sat down in her usual chair, but her expression was more serious than usual. "I didn't handle it well the first time. After my first tour, I thought I could just flip a switch and go back to being the person I was before I deployed. I thought I could pretend that nothing had changed." She paused, looking out the window at the peaceful grounds. "But everything had changed. I had changed. The things that used to seem important, career advancement, social drama, material possessions, felt trivial after what I had experienced. I couldn't relate to people who complained about traffic jams when I had spent months worrying about roadside bombs." Thompson stopped packing and turned to listen. This was exactly what he had been afraid of. "I became isolated and angry," Sarah continued. "I was impatient with everyone around me because they seemed to be living in a bubble, completely unaware of the real world where people died for causes they believed in. I started drinking too much, sleeping too little, and pushing away everyone who tried to help." "What changed?" Jake asked. "I met another veteran who had been through similar struggles. He told me something that probably saved my life. You can't go back to who you were before, but you can become someone better." Rodriguez sat on the edge of his bed. "What did he mean by that?" "He meant that trying to erase or ignore your combat experience is like trying to unlearn how to ride a bike. It's part of you now, woven into your identity. The goal isn't to get back to your old normal. It's to create a new normal that incorporates what you've learned." Sarah stood and walked to the window, gesturing toward the world beyond the hospital grounds. "Out there, most people are living on the surface of life. They're concerned with comfort and convenience and avoiding difficulty. But you've been to the depths. You've seen what people are capable of in the worst circumstances. You've experienced the full spectrum of human courage and sacrifice." She turned back to face them. "That's not a burden to be overcome. That's wisdom to be shared." Carter looked skeptical. "But how do you bridge that gap? How do you connect with people who haven't been where we've been?" "Very carefully," Sarah said with a slight smile. "And with a lot of patience. Remember, they haven't seen what you've seen, but they're still human beings struggling with their own challenges. Your job isn't to wake them up to the horrors of war. It's to bring some of the clarity and purpose you've gained to whatever situation you find yourself in." Thompson resumed his packing, but more slowly now. "Can you give us an example?" "After my second tour, I worked at a civilian hospital for a while. I was frustrated by what seemed like inefficiency and petty workplace politics. Everyone complained about equipment shortages when we had state-of-the-art machines compared to what I had worked with in field hospitals." She paused, remembering. "Instead of lecturing them about how good they had it, I started focusing on ways to improve patient care with the resources we had. I introduced some triage techniques I had learned in combat, helped streamline emergency procedures, and trained staff on how to stay calm during high-stress situations." "Did it work?" "It worked better than I expected. Within 6 months, our emergency department response times had improved dramatically, and several staff members told me they felt more confident handling critical cases. I realized that my combat experience had given me skills that were valuable in civilian settings, but only if I applied them constructively rather than using them as a weapon against people who hadn't shared those experiences." Jake leaned forward. "So you're saying we should look for ways to use what we've learned to help other people?" "I'm saying that's one path to finding meaning in your transition. When you focus on serving others, you're less likely to get stuck in your own head worrying about whether people understand you." Dr. Hawkins appeared in the doorway, having been listening from the hallway. "Sergeant Chun, would it be possible for you to speak with some of our other veteran patients?" We have several who are struggling with similar transition issues. Sarah looked around at the SEALs, who were nodding encouragingly. These men have taught me as much as I've taught them. Maybe we could develop some kind of peer support program where veterans who are further along in their recovery can mentor those who are just beginning the process. That's exactly what I was thinking, Dr. Hawkins said. Would you be interested in helping us design something like that? Before Sarah could answer, Rodriguez spoke up. I'd like to be part of that. When I get out of here, I think I could help other soldiers understand that it's okay to struggle with the transition. Thompson nodded. Me too. Maybe that's what we're supposed to do with everything we've learned. Carter looked around at his fellow SEALs, then at Sarah. Is this what you meant about transforming trauma into purpose? This is exactly what I meant, Sarah said. You take the worst things that have happened to you and find ways to use them to prevent others from going through the same pain. Or at least to help them navigate it more successfully. Jake felt a shift in his own thinking. For weeks, he had been focused on recovering from their failed mission, on somehow returning to his pre-deployment self. But Sarah was suggesting a different goal entirely, using their experience as a foundation for something larger and more meaningful. There's something else, Sarah said, her tone becoming more personal. The transition back to civilian life forced me to confront something I had been avoiding during my deployments, the question of what I wanted my life to mean beyond my military service. She sat back down, her expression thoughtful. In combat, your purpose is clear. You save lives, you protect your teammates, you complete the mission. But when you come home, you have to figure out what your purpose is going to be in a world where those immediate, life-and-death responsibilities don't exist. How do you figure that out? Thompson asked. You start by asking yourself what you care about beyond your own survival and comfort. What problems in the world do you want to help solve? What kind of legacy do you want to leave? What would make you feel at the end of your life that you had used your time well? Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. I never thought about it that way. I always assumed my purpose was my job, my mission. Your mission was your purpose while you were deployed, Sarah said. But now you get to choose your own mission. And here's the thing, you get to choose something bigger and more personal than anything the military could assign to you. As the morning progressed, the SEALs continued their conversations with Sarah. But the focus had shifted from processing their trauma to planning their futures. They began talking about the skills they had gained, the perspectives they had developed, and the ways they might contribute to causes larger than themselves. By lunchtime, the 3 SEALs who were being discharged no longer seemed anxious about leaving. Instead, they were excited about the possibilities that lay ahead. They had been given not just tools for managing their transition, but a vision for what that transition could become. As Sarah prepared to leave that afternoon, Carter called out to her. Sergeant Chun, I have one more question. What's that? Do you ever miss it? The intensity of deployment, the clarity of purpose? Sarah paused at the door, considering her answer carefully. I miss the simplicity of it sometimes. I miss knowing exactly what was expected of me and feeling absolutely certain that what I was doing mattered. But I've learned that you can create that same sense of purpose in civilian life. It just takes more intentionality and more creativity. She smiled at the group of men who had become so important to her over the past week. Besides, I think the most meaningful battles are often fought right here at home, helping people heal and grow and find their own sense of purpose. That's a mission that never ends, and it's one where every small victory makes a real difference in someone's life. As she left Ward 7 for what would be the last time, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that these men would be all right. More than that, she suspected they would go on to help many other soldiers find their way home from the wars they carried inside themselves 6 months later. Jake Morrison stood before a room full of veterans at the Wounded Warrior Transition Center, looking out at faces that reflected the same mixture of pain and uncertainty he had carried during his own recovery. Behind him, a projection screen displayed the mission statement of the peer support program that had grown from those conversations in Ward 7. Transforming trauma into purpose, veterans helping veterans find their way home. When I first met Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun, Jake began, I thought she was just another medical professional who would poke and prod and then move on to the next patient. I had no idea that she would fundamentally change how I understood my own experiences and what they could mean for my future. In the back of the room, Sarah sat quietly, taking notes as Jake spoke. She had been invited to observe the first official session of the program she had helped design, but she preferred to stay in the background. This was their show now, their mission to own and execute. Next to Jake, Rodriguez adjusted his weight slightly, favoring his left leg, which still ached in cold weather. The first thing Sarah taught us, Rodriguez said, was that there's a difference between healing and going back to who you used to be. Healing means integrating your experiences into a new version of yourself, one that's stronger and more purposeful than before. The audience of 23 veterans listened intently. They ranged in age from early 20s to late 50s, representing conflicts from Iraq and Afghanistan to older engagements that had left their own invisible scars. What united them was the struggle to find meaning and direction after leaving military service. Thompson stepped forward, his own scars visible on his forearms where shrapnel had torn through muscle and tendon. I want to tell you about the worst day of my recovery, he said. It wasn't the day I got injured, or even the day I realized I might not be able to return to active duty. It was the day I went to a shopping mall with my family and had a complete breakdown because I couldn't handle the crowds, the noise, the sense that everyone around me was living in a bubble while people were dying overseas. Several veterans in the audience nodded, recognizing the experience he described. That was the day I realized that my biggest enemy wasn't my physical injuries. It was my own sense of isolation, my belief that nobody could understand what I had been through. Sarah helped me realize that isolation was a choice and I could make a different choice. Carter, now serving as the program's full-time coordinator, moved to the front of the room. The hollow look that had haunted his eyes in the hospital was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from having found his purpose. The program we're launching today is based on a simple premise, Carter said. Veterans who have successfully navigated the transition from military to civilian life can provide something to struggling veterans that no one else can. Proof that it's possible to build a meaningful life after trauma. He gestured toward Jake, Rodriguez, and Thompson. We're not therapists or counselors. We're your brothers and sisters who have walked the same path you're walking now. We felt the same confusion, the same anger, the same sense that the world doesn't make sense anymore. And we've learned some things along the way that we want to share with you. Sarah watched as the three SEALs outlined their approach, which combined structured group discussions with individual mentoring and practical workshops on everything, from job interview skills to managing triggers in civilian environments. It was ambitious and comprehensive, but more importantly, it was authentic. These men had lived everything they were teaching. During the break, a young Marine named David approached Sarah. He had lost his right arm to an IED blast and was struggling with both his physical limitations and his sense of identity. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I heard that you were the one who helped those SEALs figure things out. I was wondering if you could tell me something." "What's that?" "Do you really believe that what happened to us can become something positive? Because right now it just feels like everything good about my life ended over there." Sarah studied his face, seeing the same desperation she had observed in Ward 7 6 months earlier. "David, can I ask you something? What did you love most about being a Marine?" "Everything," he said without hesitation. The sense of belonging, the mission, knowing that what I was doing mattered. Feeling like I was part of something bigger than myself. "And you think you've lost all of that? How can I be part of something bigger when I can't even button my own shirt some days?" Sarah smiled gently. "David, look around this room. Do you see those veterans over there talking with Jake? 3 weeks ago, one of them was living in his car because he couldn't handle being around people. Now he's volunteering at a homeless shelter and considering going back to school." She pointed toward another group. "That woman talking to Rodriguez? She's a former Army medic who thought her PTSD made her useless. Now she's training therapy dogs for other veterans. David followed her gaze, beginning to see the room differently. Your injury doesn't disqualify you from serving something bigger than yourself, Sarah continued. It qualifies you to serve in ways you never imagined. You now have experiences and perspectives that can literally save other people's lives. The question isn't whether you can still matter. It's how you want to matter. But I'm broken, David said. No, Sarah replied firmly. You're broken open. There's a difference. Broken means damaged beyond repair. Broken open means cracked in ways that let light in and let love out. She gestured toward the front of the room where Carter was explaining the mentoring component of the program. That young man was convinced he was a coward 6 months ago. Now he's running a program that will help hundreds of veterans find their way back to meaningful lives. His trauma didn't disqualify him from leadership. It equipped him for it. David was quiet for a moment, absorbing this perspective. How do I start? How do I figure out what my purpose is supposed to be? The same way all of us did, Sarah said. You start by accepting help from people who understand what you're going through. You start by being honest about your struggles instead of trying to hide them. And you start by looking for small ways to use your experiences to help other people. She handed him a card with Carter's contact information. Join this program. Give it 6 months of your full effort and attention. I think you'll be surprised by what you discover about yourself. As the session resumed, Sarah watched David take a seat in the front row, his posture more upright than it had been when he arrived. Around the room, other veterans were beginning to engage more actively, asking questions and sharing their own stories. Jake was in the middle of describing how the program worked when he caught Sarah's eye. Actually, he said, I think we should hear from the person who started all of this. Sergeant Chun, would you mind saying a few words? Sarah felt momentarily uncomfortable with the attention, but she stood and moved to the front of the room. Looking out at the faces before her, she was struck by how much they reminded her of her own younger self, struggling to find meaning after experiencing the extremes of human experience. When I first walked into Ward 7, she began, I thought I was there to help some wounded soldiers process their trauma and get back to their normal lives. I had no idea that they would teach me as much as I taught them, or that our conversations would lead to something like this. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The truth is, none of us gets to choose what happens to us. We don't get to choose whether we experience trauma or loss or pain, but we do get to choose what we do with those experiences. We get to choose whether they become weights that drag us down or foundations that we build. Upon Rodriguez nodded encouragingly. From his seat, every person in this room has been tested in ways that most people never will be, Sarah continued. You've been broken down and forced to discover what you're really made of. You've seen the worst that humanity has to offer, but you've also experienced the best, the courage, the sacrifice, the unbreakable bonds that form between people who face danger together. She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many veterans as possible. That's not damage to be repaired. That's wisdom to be shared. That's strength to be deployed in service of something larger than your own healing. The room was completely quiet, hanging on every word. The mission isn't over just because you're no longer in uniform, Sarah said. The mission has evolved. Now your job is to use everything you've learned, everything you've become, to help other people navigate their own dark moments. To be living proof that it's possible to transform trauma into purpose, pain into power, isolation into connection. She smiled at Jake, Carter, Rodriguez, and Thompson. These men figured out how to do that, and they're going to teach you. Not because they're experts, but because they're survivors who have learned how to thrive. And someday, when you found your own way forward, you'll teach the next group of veterans who walk through these doors carrying the same questions you're carrying right now. As Sarah returned to her seat, the room erupted in the first.